and you may begin your presentation.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Christine Van Gyn, and I'm the Ontario Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. This is my third year presenting to this committee on behalf of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation and on behalf of our supporters. We're a federally incorporated not-for-profit organization with over 136,000 supporters across Canada, and our mandate is to advocate for lower taxes, less government waste, and improved government accountability. In my past years presenting to this committee, I've suggested ideas how we could reduce waste, for example, with some very specific reforms to the electricity sector. I've suggested ways of lowering taxes, for example, by eliminating double taxation on gasoline. And I've suggested ways of improving accountability, for example, reducing the number of patronage appointments, stopping taxpayer subsidies to political parties, and by restoring the Auditor General's power to review government advertising for partisan content. And this year I do have some of those same suggestions. They're contained in my report. But overall, my request today is really simple. It's a simple plea for honesty from this government. All I ask is that the budget provide Ontario voters with an accurate picture of the state of the province's finances. 2018 is an election year, and we know that the budget will contain the promises that the government plans to campaign on. But it must also contain the accurate cost of these promises and the truth about the government's fiscal record. And right now, I'm deeply concerned that the budget will not do this. Members of this committee are all aware that last year the Auditor General issued a qualified audit opinion on the government's consolidated financial statements. The Auditor General found that the statements significantly understate the 2016-17 deficit as well as the province's net debt. Both the Auditor General and the Financial Accountability Officer have found that when using Canadian public sector accounting standards, the government has understated both the debt and the deficit. And in total, Ontario this year will have more than $4 billion deficit, and next year that will grow to $7.1 billion. The government will also be increasing net debt by more than $75 billion over the next 4 years, reaching a staggering $404 billion. The government is misleading the public by continuing to claim that the budget is balanced when both the Auditor General and the Financial Accountability Officer has determined that there is in fact a multi-billion-dollar deficit. The public deserves to know the truth about the province's finances every year, but this is even more important in an election year. And while a fight over accounting standards isn't an easy one for the public to follow or feel passionately about, the impact of using one standard over another can be very significant. After giving itself the power to prescribe their own accounting standards when valuing pensions rather than using the generally accepted Canadian public sector accounting standards, the Premier and Finance Minister are able to state a much more favorable financial snapshot to the public. The model that the government does rely on gives the government the ability to count pension surpluses in the OPSU and teachers' plans as assets. However, these are not truly usable assets unless the government's planning on reducing their contributions to those plans and using that money to instead spend in the spring budget. Does the government plan to do this? If so, OPSU has stated its opposition to this plan, stating that the pension surpluses are for the benefit of pension plan members and has sided with the Auditor General's accounting. Shifting accounting models for political reasons is inappropriate, and it empowers future governments to manipulate accounting methods in order to continue to mislead the public. And this in turn has the effect of eroding public trust in their government and in the budget that they present. Voters and citizens deserve better. We deserve consistency, honesty, and accuracy. That's why today I'm recommending the government follow the recommendation of the Auditor General and use these generally accepted Canadian public sector accounting standards in this year's budget. And that's not the only way the government could ensure the budget's an honest document that reflects the reality of the province's finances. The government could also improve transparency regarding their Fair Hydro plan. This past fall, I traveled across Ontario and I met with people from across the province who are struggling to pay their electricity bills. I spoke with business owners who form an organization called the Coalition of Concerned Manufacturers about the industrial electricity rates that they pay, which have increased between 30 and 40% since 2012. I came here to Kitchener, where I met with a convenience store owner, Mr. Kwan from Sonny's Mini Mart, who is a part of the Save Our Stores Coalition and is concerned that the high cost of electricity is going to force him to close his store's doors. And I've been running a campaign releasing the electricity bills for hospitals across the province. Here in Kitchener, I found that the electricity bills for St. Mary's Hospital had grown by 26% over 4 years, even though consumption has fallen by over 100,000 kilowatts. The $316,000 that St. Mary's spent on additional electricity costs could have been used instead to pay for 36 hip replacements, but instead was squandered on high electricity bills. The government right now does not have a plan to solve this problem. The Fair Hydro plan that they have enacted is an exercise in debt shifting. Even using the government's own accounting figures, the cost of the plan will be $21 billion over 29 years, and that's only if the government can maintain their so-called balanced budget for 29 years. The more realistic estimate of the cost, according to the Financial Accountability Officer, is upwards of $93 billion. And once again, that plan is failing to use Canadian public sector accounting standards and hides the financial impact of the plan on the province's debt and deficit. The plan also adds $4 billion in additional and unnecessary interest payments because it uses government entities for borrowing instead of borrowing through the government directly. This is a two-pronged negative effect. Using government entities to borrow hides the cost of the plan from the government's bottom line, and it also adds to the cost of borrowing since these entities must pay higher interest rates than the government would itself. Spending $93 billion to save $24 billion is not sustainable, and it doesn't address the problems of why electricity rates are so high. That's why today we recommend that the government scrap the plan in its entirety as it's currently designed and instead focus on resolving some of the larger underlying problems with the electricity sector. And there are a few suggestions in my report on some steps the government could take to achieve this. But right now, the most important thing in the lead up to an election and in the lead up to the next budget is to provide transparency. Without an accurate understanding of the province's finances, the cost of the current hydro plan, and the cost of the current hydro plan, long-term solutions to the public policy issues we face will be out of reach. For the remainder of my time, I'd like to focus on an additional measure to improve public discourse and honesty in public policy. In particular, I'd like to focus on changes to the Election Finances Act, which have created a de facto gag law on political speech. A gag law that impedes the ability of the public and of policy advocates like myself from commenting on the budget once it's tabled. 2 years ago, the government broadened the definition of political advertising to include, for all practical purposes, any political speech. Any individual or organization in Ontario that spends more than $500 to publicize their position on an issue that can be reasonably or closely associated with a registered party or its leader is now engaging in political advertising. The legislation requires any third party to register with the government, file an onerous report, and be subject to spending limits. And unlike long-held restrictions on speech during the campaign period and upheld by the Supreme Court in Harper and Canada, these new Ontario requirements apply 6 months before the call of an election.
1 minute.
These are in effect gag laws limiting the ability of individuals, groups, and essentially any non-politician to support or level criticism against the government. For example, if I decided to launch a petition after the budget is tabled relating to any new program announced in that budget, I wouldn't be able to spend any money advertising that petition to the public, or more than $500, without subjecting myself to that new regulation. The laws aimed at regulating the pre-campaign period are in all likelihood a charter violation. Almost identical and indeed less onerous restrictions on pre-campaign speech were repeatedly found unconstitutional and struck down in British Columbia. Now, I apologize if my frustration here is obvious, but I'm faced with a government that both the Auditor General and the Financial Accountability Officer consider as misleading the public. The government has thus far refused to take their advice on how to restore honesty in public accounting, so I'm sadly not optimistic they'll take my advice today. The only remedy is to...
We move now to the third party, MVP Vanto.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation. May I call you Christine?
Yes, of course.
Thank you, Christine.